So, today we're going to talk about the consequences of the Industrial Revolution. And first, we're going to focus on the conditions for the working class. Remember, you should be taking Cornell notes throughout this presentation. So, why were the working conditions in the factory so poor? Well, it's poor for a number of reasons. First, there was an exhausting work schedule and very long work days. It was very common for people to be working anywhere from 12 to 15 hours a day. You wouldn't get bathroom breaks. Your lunch break would be very short, maybe 30 minutes. Then there was the hazardous working conditions. It was very unsafe inside the factories for a lot of people. It was not uncommon for you to lose limbs or fingers, toes. And additionally, for there to be explosions that might take place that could take your life. As part of those hazardous conditions, there was poor worker safety. The owners didn't care too much about the safety of workers. They often employed children so that they could fit in between the machines easier. And then there was a poor wage. Many of the workers had to work such long hours because they were not being paid a sufficient living wage. It was not uncommon for families to purposely have children so that their children could then go and work in the factories to bring in money for the household. And oftentimes you had people living together because they just were not getting paid enough. What was the impact of child labor laws? So, the Factory Act of 1833 in Britain attempted to restrict child labor to children older than 9 years of age, as well as to reduce the working hours. In the United States, the laws focused on minimum ages in order to promote higher education. However, the laws had very little impact as companies often ignored them or the law was poorly enforced. Child labor made up a pretty significant part of the workforce during the Industrial Revolution. And as mentioned in the previous slide, their safety was definitely being affected and not well protected. I'm going to tell you a couple of quotes about how these affected children and their bodies. So, according to Elizabeth Bentley from Britain, she was a witness that appeared before a committee that was looking into child labor and their safety. And she talked about how working in the card room of a factory seriously damaged her health. She stated, "It was so dusty, the dust got up my lungs, and the work was so hard. I got so bad in health that when I pulled the baskets down, I pulled my bones out of their places." Bentley went on to explain how she was considerably deformed. It started around the time she was 13 years old and just got worse and worse. A doctor that was in front of the committee, Dr. Samuel Smith, also gave evidence to the same committee. He said that up to 12 or 13 years of age, the bones are so soft that they can bend easily in any direction. And the kind of work that was being performed in this factory greatly affected the children's soft bones. He said the foot is formed of an arch of bones of a wedge like shape. These arches have to sustain the whole weight of the body. I am now frequently seen in the habit of these cases in which this arch has completely given way. Long continued standing has also an injurious effect upon the ankles, but the principal effects which I have seen that have been produced in this way have been on the knees. By long continued standing, the knees become so weak that they turn inwards, producing a deformity which is called knock knees, and I've sometimes seen it so striking that the individual has actually lost 12 inches of his height by it. So the next part for your Cornell notes is explain the conditions in the tenements and how is urbanization related to the creation of tenements. So a tenement is essentially a type of apartment building. They were typically very dirty and very overcrowded, often quite narrow and close together, similar to how the picture is on the screen. Often they were dangerous places to live because there was a lack of light as well as a lack of fresh air. They also lacked sewer services. Okay, so no sewer services, You're talking about you're often going to the bathroom in a bucket or a pot, and this promoted the spread of diseases. Urbanization contributed to the creation of tenements as many people had migrated from the countryside into the cities in order to find work in factories. And because of the number of people that were migrating, they needed to build housing quite quickly for them, and a lot of it with a limited amount of space. Um, Therefore, in order to house such a large population, the tenements were created. Often with these tenements, you would have one or two rooms housing several families or several different groups of workers, not necessarily related to each other. Again, that's related to the poor wages that they were making at the factories. They had to share housing in order to survive. Next, we're going to talk about the labor movement. So, listen describe three labor organizations in the United States during the Industrial Revolution. So, first, we have a group called the Knights of Labor. This organization attracted many members due to its policy of accepting both skilled and unskilled workers, as well as women and African Americans, and that would have been very uncommon for the age. Then we have the American Federation of Labor. This organization focused on organizing skilled workers. The AFL fought for higher wages and shorter workdays. And last, we have the Industrial Workers of the World. This organization introduced the socialist theories of Karl Marx in their pursuit for better working conditions. So, this labor organization and movement during the Industrial Revolution is really the beginning of our unions. And you can thank them for having a minimum wage. You can thank them for having 8 or 10 hour days instead of 12 to 15-hour days, for requiring breaks and lunches, sick leave without being fired, all kinds of things we can thank due to these early labor organizations and our modern day unions today. So, next, I want you to draw the chart that's on the screen. It's a cause and effect diagram. And you're going to use this diagram to summarize two different causes and two effects due to the cause described in the following slides. So, strike causes. What led to strikes during the Industrial Revolution was the poor working conditions as well as the low pay. The workers were also not getting any sort of response from the employers in order to let the workers stop working as a way to have their demands met. This was often used as a last resort. So, when they wouldn't get a response or a proper response from the employer, they would then just refuse to stop working, and that was called a strike. Effects of the strikes. Some strikes often turned violent in order to break the strike and force employees to work again. So it's violence on the part of the factory owners on their workers that were striking. Other strikes would sometimes end when the employees agreed to demands and when employers agreed to demands as well. Labor union causes. Labor unions were caused by the dangerous working conditions and low pay, which led workers to form groups in order to fight for their rights. The idea was you're a lot stronger together as a group rather than individually. The effects of labor unions is that they negotiated, often by going on strike, to win improvements for working conditions such as a 10-hour workday as well as higher pay. So, who was Adam Smith? Adam Smith was a Scottish philosopher and economist, and he's best known as the author of An Inquiry into Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. And it's considered to be one of the most influential books ever written in economics as well as social welfare. So, Smith's views on human societies. He had a radical, fresh understanding of how human societies actually worked. He realized that social harmony would emerge naturally as human beings struggled to find ways to live and work with each other. Freedom and self interest didn't need to produce chaos. If it's guided by an invisible hand, there can be a maintenance of order and concord. As people strike bargains with each other, the nation's resources would be drawn automatically to the ends and purposes that people valued most highly. So, a prospering society and social order didn't need to be controlled by kings and ministers. It would just kind of grow organically or naturally as a product of human nature. And it's going to grow the best if you have an open, competitive marketplace where there's free exchange of goods without coercion or being forced to do so. So, how did Adam Smith support laissez faire economics? So, Adam Smith would have supported a laissez faire economic policy because he believed that society is best served when producers seek profit. They create food and other goods and sell them at market at competitive prices. That's that open market of competition that was discussed in the last slide. And you believe that government shouldn't be interfering in this process. Now, laissez faire is a doctrine that opposes government interference in economic affairs beyond the minimum amount necessary to maintain peace and property rights. So basically, they want very little government involvement in the economy and business. So, in your notes, I want you to list one way you think government should have been regulating big business in the 1800s. This here is a political cartoon, and it's showing the Standard Oil Company basically as a kraken, okay, or which would be similar to a giant squid or an octopus, and how it's reaching all its tentacles into different parts of the world as well as government. Okay, we have the White House pictured here, and it's controlling all these different individuals, it's taking over. So it's this big corporation, and how it has maybe too much power, is what the cartoon is implying, and that it's controlling the government rather than the government regulating them. The last topic for your notes is a worldwide trend. So, a big way that the Industrial Revolution impacts the world is through its environmental impacts as a result of industrialization. So, a big part of the Industrial Revolution required the mining of coal because the coal was used to power a lot of the factories and inventions that were coming out, such as the steam engine. So, the burning of coal produced a lot of gases in our environment as well as ash. The factories and tenements created water pollution. And then we also had the depletion of resources. We're mining away the coal resources, we're cutting down forests to make way for factories and tenements. And one thing that's really interesting is actually there was a study on how the Industrial Revolution impacted the peppered moth, which is what's pictured right here. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, the peppered moth mostly came in a very light, almost white or very light gray form. But through natural selection, the moth began to change throughout the Industrial Revolution and after it ended. Because the factories were producing so much ash, it was actually covering the trees in the area of the factories, making the trees bark very, very dark because they had all this soot. And therefore, the moths that were dark or black were surviving because they were able to blend in with that soot. So they bred together, and they were more likely to survive if they had that dark gene. So now it's actually very rare to have a light colored peppered moth. You tend to see the darker colors due to the natural selection that took place with the Industrial Revolution. Other environmental impacts, too, like I mentioned, was the water pollutants. That was something very big with the Industrial Revolution. The drinking water was being contaminated by essentially feces and causing cholera, which was a really feared disease during the time. And basically, if you drink contaminated water with human feces, you could potentially get cholera. Okay. And it could potentially kill you. Um, there's another quote that a person wrote down in a letter to someone in the government about the appearance of the river in Great Britain. And this is what he wrote. So he traversed this day by steamboat the space between London and Hangerford. The appearance and smell of the water forced themselves at once to my attention. The whole of the river was an opaque, pale brown fluid. The smell was very bad and common to the whole of the water. The whole river was for the time a real sewer. So, the last slide. How did industrial revolution lead to an age of imperialism? So, after this unit, we're going to start studying the age of imperialism, but industrialization had a big part to do with that. So, industrialization led to an age of imperialism, which is where there was a high demand for natural resources in order to produce the goods, led countries to rely on other countries to supply them. So, this established a new global dynamic where major producers began to rely on smaller countries to supply them with these resources. So, the industrialized countries such as France, Britain, Japan, they needed Russia, Italy, they needed more resources. They had depleted their natural resources in their own country, so they had to start looking elsewhere. Okay. And these industrialized countries fight for control of these other smaller countries, which you will get to learn about in the following unit.